We've talked about the Great Migration, which really is underway by the 1890s or so, and refers to the movement of black folks out of the South, where they had historically been, into the North, the Midwest, and even the West. The peak of this is during World War I, but 1 million more folks, black folks, leave the South during the 1920s. Between 1900 and 1930, 150,000 moved from the Caribbean and the West Indies to America as well. The black populations of New York, Chicago, and other northern cities double in the 1920s. Harlem is considered the capital of black America. Harlem, if you don't know, is the northern part of the island of Manhattan for the most part. And there are many black immigrant white-collar workers. These people tend to be shocked by American racism. The police are indifferent to Harlem and its residents' complaints about alcohol and noise, and so it became an area that people would go to party because the cops wouldn't break up the parties. And soon, whites would slum there. It became very common for white folks, even wealthy white folks, to go party in Harlem, much to the consternation of many of the residents in Harlem. One of the most famous institutions here is the Cotton Club, which is a black-owned, black-run business where the people who work there are black and the entertainment is black, but it is segregated and the clientele is all white. Now, this is a really interesting idea, right? Because on the one hand, it's bringing people together, and black and white people are going to get excited about black culture. But on the other hand, it also bears that stigma of segregation. The Harlem residents complained about this, but the white fantasy was that Harlem was a place beyond normal social norms. Men who are, say, interested in black women, or I guess maybe white women who are interested in black men, could go there and pretend that they were in some magical land that was outside of the rules of regular society. And they could drink and they could party with them and they could listen to their music, the great jazz music of the period, and dance. The real Harlem, of course, was low wage, filled with poverty and jacked up rents, and most Harlem businesses were owned by white people. It was also a place that drew talented black people from all over the country who claimed there. Not just musicians like the great Duke Ellington, who you see sitting there at the piano, but Louis Armstrong plays there. Cab Calloway is working there. Eventually, the guy from KC, Count Basie will be there. But we also see great literary lights like County Cullen and the great Langston Hughes, who's down there on the bottom right. Claude McKay and Zora Neale Hurston, two great writers. And they made white friends, and they got published. Broadway had black stars like Florence Mills and Ethel Waters and the great dancer Bill Bojangles Robinson. And Harlem had its own theater, which created opportunities for black writers, directors, and actors. They talked of the new Negro, which rejected the old stereotypes. And all of this is considered the Harlem Renaissance. There was a great focus on Africa as the place where their culture comes from, as well as the rural South and the urban North. Du Bois worried the focus on sex and violence would reinforce prejudice, which can't help but make me think of rap music. But they also wrote a protest. McKay wrote the powerful If We Must Die, for example. This is Langston Hughes' theme for English B. I would encourage you to pause and read this poem. I'm not going to read it to you. That's kind of weird in a video, but you should read it. In 1928, when the election came around, the Republicans turned to Herbert Hoover. Coolidge had become president when Harding had died in office. Harding had been mired in scandal, one of the most corrupt presidents in history, and he cleverly avoided being almost certainly the first president to be impeached or removed from office by dying of a massive heart attack. And so as Vice President, Calvin Coolidge became president late in his term, won election in 1924, and really hated being president. Coolidge was miserable, so he didn't run in 28. Hoover had made a fortune as a mine engineer going around the world and become a great hero for his food distribution program in World War I. Sherwood Anderson, the writer, would say about him, he had never known failure, and he became a symbol of the new era of U.S. capitalism. In 1922, he wrote a book called American Individualism, where he condemned government interference in the economy. He strongly argued that corporations should not be regulated, but should simply be asked to do the right thing, and said that they would do it. He called this volunteerism. He also said that businesses should regulate themselves by creating industry organizations, which he called associational action. He thought more cops on the streets would be the answer to the failure of prohibition. The Democrats are in a crisis, and they have been in one now since at least 1920. The problem is the Democratic Party has now become two distinctly different things. It is the old Southern racist, white supremacist power structure of the South. But it is also these new urban political machines that are heavily dependent on recent immigrants and Catholics in the North. The Democrats in the South are the driving engine behind prohibition, or one of them anyway. The Democrats in the North and the West tend to favor legalizing alcohol. Now, in 20 and 24, the two groups each had their own candidates, and they couldn't decide on one. In 1928, the Northern group finally wins. They finally get their guy. And their guy is Al Smith, who I mentioned before because he's one of the guys who investigated the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire. This is a wet Irish Catholic, first-generation American. Now, remember, there's still a heavy stigma against Catholicism, so that's a big deal in America at the time. He's also a first-generation American from Ireland, which also has quite a bit of stigma to it. But he had been the three-time governor of New York, and the Democrats tried to embrace pluralism. He was a progressive who had pushed hard to protect workers. He had denounced the Red Scare. He had repealed laws against alcohol in New York. His opponents accused him of running on rum and Romanism. If you don't get the reference there, Romanism, because that's where the Pope is, the leader of the Catholic Church. Protestants attacked Smith viciously. In fact, Protestants for the first time endorsed, Protestant organizations, many for the first time endorsed a presidential candidate in Hoover because Smith was a Catholic. Democratic Southern newspapers referred to Smith as an alien. Hoover, they said, had sprung from American soil and stock. Smith wins the 12 largest cities, and he wins the farm areas that were already suffering from the Great Depression. But Hoover, in the end, wins in a landslide because nominating a Catholic had shattered the Democratic coalition. Hoover's inaugural focuses on, quote, the failure of our system of criminal justice. He calls for reform, reorganization, and strengthening of our whole judicial and enforcement system. Prohibition had made crime a national issue for the first time in our history, and the Wickersham Commission examines the causes of crime. Politicians, for the first time, began running as tough on crime. This is also, though, in response to the Great Migration and the massive wave of immigrants from places that had not been traditional source of immigration, because Americans tend to see black people, of course, and immigrants that they're not comfortable with as criminals. Hoover builds prisons and expands the power of the Bureau of Investigation, which becomes the Federal Bureau of Investigation in 1935. He doubles the Border Patrol, which had been established in 1924. And in 1930, he creates the Federal Bureau of Narcotics that we now call the DEA. He deports immigrants convicted on drug charges out of the country. And this is where the beginning of, making your political career on fighting crime comes.